she was like, Happy St. Patrick's Day. Hi, Joe.
It's one of these things where in the U.S., because everyone's got heritage from all over, it's and many people in the U.S. do have Irish heritage, and myself included. It's a very sort of widely appropriated holiday. So it's I don't know. I don't know how actual Irish people feel about that.
Yeah. Can actually see that. Normally I can see the chat button on Teams, but I can't see it today.
I can't see it either.
Yeah, I see the participants button. Just saying it, Stephen, in case, because if I can't trigger, then I won't see the questions, which is fine. It's just making you aware of this. I can't see the chat button. It could be to do with the fact that I am joining from outside. I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes we do get that, and I'm never really sure when and when not the chat is accessible to outside participants. But yeah, let's then we'll try and keep questions on the sort of vocalized.
Yeah, that's fine.
So John, I can send you a message. So if you want, I can try.
Yeah, I can't even do that. Well, maybe I can.
I don't know. I send it. I don't know if you see it.
Yeah. Oh, maybe I do. Hang on. It does come up, but it comes up in the Teams chat outside of this call, which is really strange. So like it did come up on my Teams, but as a separate chat. So yeah, it's a little bit unusual, I would say. I think we should just assume I won't see the questions on the chat.
Yeah, I think that's a safe assumption. Well, yeah. So for everyone here, please, if you've got a question that you want raised during the talk, just raise your hand, and I'll try and interrupt and. So we're about 4 minutes past. So I think it's probably okay to go ahead and get started. We've got about 20 people already joining us. Probably a few more going to file in after a few minutes or so. But we are very delighted to welcome Joanna Clifton Sprigg from University of Bath here to talk to us today about Brexit and hate crime. We are also lucky that Joanna's co-authors are here as well. So, Joanna, if you like, you can throw them under the bus.
Or depending on the questions, I might do.
answer questions for you. But whenever you are ready, take it away.
Okay, so let me try and share the slides with you and see if I can get this going. Hopefully, you can see the slides now. I don't think I can see that. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to present this work to you. This is very much an ongoing project jointly with Jonathan James, who's also at the University of Bath, and Joel Carr and Sunčica Vujić, who are based at the University of Antwerp. The project is at quite an advanced stage, but we're still working on it. So I'm happy to hear any comments you might have related to the context, empirics, or whatever thoughts you might have. As the title probably reveals, we're interested in the relationship between Brexit and particularly the referendum, which took place in June 2016, and occurrence of hate crime in England and Wales. So I'm hoping I don't have to motivate this too much to this crowd, but the UK vote to leave the EU came as a surprise, And following that vote in June 2016, there have been reports of increased number of hate crimes in England and Wales, and specifically already in July 2016, so a month after the vote roughly, data emerged from Home Office that would suggest that there was a 41% increase in offences, racially and religiously aggravated offences that compared to July 2015, which is really a shocking piece of information. In the graph on the slide, you can see a plot that we just prepared using data that we obtained through Freedom of Information requests. These are monthly. It's just to show you that indeed there is a spike in hate crime following the referendum. So we marked with the vertical lines various events, just for a bit of a context, starting from the Rigby attack, then European Parliament elections, then general election, and then EU referendum is the very last horizontal line, most to the right of the graph, which would be in July 2000 or end of June 2016, and you can see a much bigger spike in racial and religious hate crimes over that period. And although you can also see a kind of an upward trend in general in the hate crimes. And then that's just to prove that there have been reports of this increase, a screenshot from BBC website reporting the statistics from Home Office. What we really want to know is whether the referendum indeed caused this increase in hate crimes, whether it's entirely or in part, or has it simply coincided with it? And that's partly because, as many of you probably are thinking about it, there have been many other economic and political factors within the UK context at that point that could have been easily attributed both to the vote and to occurrence of hate crime. Secondly, one might worry that following referendum and reports of hate crimes and sort of anti-immigration sentiment, people might have become more sensitive to the issue of hate crime, and we could have observed increased reporting by victims or witnesses. Equally, we might have seen also better recording by police as a response. So we will speak to these potential channels as well. And there is a question that we're interested in, whether there is any evidence that this has been amplified by media, traditional media or social media. We will also be able to tackle a question of whether this effect was temporary or permanent within a reasonably medium term, I think, length, and whether the effect was homogeneous across areas of England and Wales. So we'll use only data from England and Wales because of data availability, but we can look at different geographical areas within the two states of the UK. In terms of methodology, we will start off with the traditional diff and diff, then we'll follow by event study analysis to have a bit of a better understanding of the timing of effects that we find in diff and diff. But because we have some concerns about parallel trend assumptions and control group or finding suitable control group for this particular context, we also use synthetic control methods, and that's probably, I would say, that's our preferred method really, that we use for drawing conclusions. So now I touched on this. The control group here is not obvious because Brexit is a national event as such, and we can't really use variations across geographic variations within the country. So what we do is we treat the racial and religious hate crimes as the treated crime group, and then other crime categories are our control group. I'll touch upon this a little bit later in more detail. You might already, those of you who have worked with synthetic control methods or have come across them before, probably already think that this is unusual. So we do some checks on this in when running synth as well, where we use other countries to build the synthetic control method, synthetic control instead. And I will show you these results as well. In terms of the data that we use, we start off with quarterly data for community safety partnership areas. These are roughly overlapping with local authority areas in England and Wales, so quite small areas. There's about 315 of them in the country. And we look at the effects by quarter, but then to have a better grasp on the exact timing of the effect, we also have monthly data on counts of hate crime at police force level. So that's more aggregated areas. That's about 45, I think. And this we obtained using freedom of information requests. So just to cut to the chase, in terms of the results, we find an average rise in recorded hate crime in a range of 15 to 20%, depending on the specification used, which is really much less than the Home Office reports of the 41% increase on previous year. We do find that this increase seems to be concentrated in the first quarter after the referendum. And when we use monthly data, it appears to be the case that it really is just the first month after the referendum. We do find also that the increase was larger in leave areas, so areas that voted to leave the EU. We have some suggestive evidence on the role of media and social media, and I should say here none of this is causal. So here we're just presenting some correlations where a 1% increase in hate crime media reporting would correlate with 0.04% increase in racial and religious hate crimes around Brexit vote. And then the Brexit coverage is also correlated positively. As I said, we will look at changes to recording and reporting behavior as potential explanations, and we conclude that they don't explain the full effect that we find. Overall, we suggest that this might be pointing towards the fact that social norms might be changing quite quickly, and I'll explain what we mean by this, but that change doesn't seem to be lasting based on our results. So in terms of the roadmap for the talk, I'll give you a background, although I believe probably to this audience I don't have to explain much of what happened in June 2016. I will very briefly touch on the literature and then really focus mostly on data, methods and results, because I think that's the kind of beef of the paper. So the EU referendum, there has been a growing pressure to hold a referendum already in 2010s as UKIP gradually came to power, and Conservative Party made a commitment in general election in 2015 to actually hold the referendum. And so in the run-up, there were two official campaigns, Vote Leave and Britain Stronger in Europe, and then the unofficial Leave campaign. And the referendum itself happened in, towards the end of June 2016, precisely on the 23rd of June. In the run-up of the referendum, there were two really leading themes. On the Vote Leave campaign, it was all about migration, and I've got some evocative posters to remind you what we were looking at back then. Things that kind of the themes that appeared were like were along the lines of Turkey joining EU and threatening population in the UK with significant inflow of immigrants, highlighting that EU is at a breaking point, and this was particularly coincided nicely with the refugee crisis in Europe in 2015, I think. So these are actual posters used by the campaign. Despite this, though, I think for a long time the expectation was that the vote outcome would be to remain. So we looked at the betting odds and opinion polls, and you can see on this graph in the top panel are the betting odds. You can see that for a long time, right until June 2016, it looked like Remain was going to be the leading outcome. And to that extent, we would argue that the outcome itself was a shock to many, for sure. And we plot the referendum results on a map to show you how these coincide with the areas that we're going to be working with in the data. So one data set, the quarterly data, comes from the Community Safety Partnerships. So on the in panel A of the map, you can see the mapping of the referendum results on the areas that we're working with. And the darker the color, the higher percentage voted to leave. So the very dark black is more than 60%. You can see there is variation in the vote, as we know. with Scotland being less likely to want to leave, and Wales as well compared to England. We have a similar pattern on the police force areas, so in panel B, but here, because these areas are more aggregated, the differences are less, I think, less pronounced. So they're more striking when you go into the small areas, geographic areas. But there's variation across the country. In terms of how the voters perceived or why they were voting to leave or remain, this is these are two word clouds lifted from a study by Prosser on based on questions from British elections study as to what mattered most when deciding to vote in the EU referendum. And with the voters who voted to leave, the themes they highlighted as key for them in the decision were immigration, sovereignty, borders. So anything that was kind of responding to the targeted campaign, I think, for vote leave EU, whereas for the Remain voters, the themes that seemed to persuade them to vote Remain were kind of oscillating around economy and Europe and trade. So these are really two different groups and two different themes, but these were the main themes that were kind of part of the debate in the run-up, and it's important for the narrative here. After the vote itself, we do have quite quickly we obtained anecdotal evidence of a significant increase in hate crimes. So I already showed you the articles that appeared quickly in the newspapers, but there have been also studies, mostly descriptives, that have looked at, for example, hate crimes reported to NPCC immediately after the referendum, and there has been a significant increase with explicit references made to the referendum. There are records of people saying, "Leave, we voted you out," or "Go home." And there's now a study also by Veery and McGeever that suggests that these attacks might have not really made a distinction between white European migrants and other non-white minorities. So it seemed to be that the attacks were directed at anyone who might have appeared non-British, which might be a little bit counterintuitive, I guess, given that if we left the EU, or when we left the EU, the only control of migration that we would gain that we didn't have before would have been over European migrants or EU migrants. So let me touch very briefly on the literature. I think this paper is well positioned among the literature on hate crimes in general, and until recently, most of the studies looking at hate crimes focused on shock events like terror attacks. So there's a lot on Islamic terrorist attacks following 9/11, 7/7, or Manchester bombings, in which the resultant hate crime is seen as a retaliation against being attacked or values being attacked. More recently, there has been increased focus on analysis of hate crimes following political events. So, for example, Trump's election in the US, and in particular, not just recording hate crimes, but also starting to reveal change in attitudes and prejudices after the election. So particularly the recent paper by Leonardo Burson and his co-authors looks at willingness to express anti-immigrant views following Trump's election. And there is also a branch of literature starting to look at how social media can fuel hate crimes as well. So we kind of speak to all of these, but specifically on the referendum itself, the EU referendum, there has been a significant number of papers which look at who voted for Brexit, so demographics and groups, and then the drivers of the vote, and then the resultant impacts on the economy, whether it's just forecasts or immediate impacts on the economy. To the best of our knowledge, there are 3 papers which look at the effect of the referendum on hate crime itself. I'm happy to hear if you're aware of more of those. We would like to know about those. So there's a paper by Devine which uses UK aggregate data and undertakes a time series analysis. Then Claudia Schilter, I believe, does machine learning using data from just London and Manchester. And he finds an average increase in hate crimes following the referendum around 21%. I think the closest in terms of the content or the approach as well to ours is the last paper by Albornoz, Bradley and Zonderger, who look at the effect of the referendum focusing on hate crimes in Leave and Remain areas. So their focus is on this heterogeneity between Leave and Remain. They are using the same data set, so they're using the quarterly CSP data. And they find that there was indeed an effect, and that the effect was larger in Leave areas, in Remain areas, which is contrasting result to ours. And we kind of fought really hard about why this might be, and we think parts of it are related to the approach. So even though they're using the same data, they are going to they mostly rely on the difference in difference analysis, which we will argue might not necessarily, the assumptions of it might not necessarily hold, and so we prefer to use synth. The specification is slightly different, so they don't have the same set of controls that we will have, particularly the number of trends that we control for. And their coefficient of interest is the coefficient on an interaction term between a Brexit indicator and the share who voted to remain. They built this around a model in which they argue that the Remain areas would have experienced a bigger shock, information shock as a result of the vote, and therefore would have then backlashed harder. Our logic will be slightly different. So we also think Brexit was an information shock and updated people's beliefs, but we think it might have worked in a way to persuade people in Leave areas who were potentially already holding stronger anti-immigrant views, that what they're believing is potentially more socially acceptable, and that might be more encouraging than to commit hate crime. So we see the potential mechanisms differently here as well. What we bring in this paper, I think, is the fact that we can look at monthly changes. So we have this unique data set that we obtain through Freedom of Information requests. We will look at heterogeneous effects of Brexit by area characteristics and then Leave and Remain. We will speak to the potential mechanisms of the effect we find and touch upon the correlation between media and social media coverage and the outcomes. So before I show the data, let me also introduce you to how we see it. So the model is definitely not the key element of the paper. It's very much an applied paper, but we thought it might help to explain the logic behind the effect that we might find here. So we think about it in simple terms, going back to the rational choice model of crime, first introduced by Gary Becker. So we're arguing that one would commit crime if the expected benefit of doing so is higher than the expected cost, okay? And then the expected cost of committing crime would be a function of length of sentence that one might face when captured. Then in this case, we will argue that the anti-immigrant sentiment in the country could matter, because if it's a common knowledge that the country is actually quite negatively has a negative attitude toward immigrants, it might be less costly to actually commit crime in that direction. And then it's also a function of probability of being caught. And there are a number of factors that, of course, affect the probability of being caught. But apart from the usual factors that matter here, we think the anti-immigrant sentiment itself might also be a factor, because crime has to be reported. And so if there might be changing likelihood of reporting crime depending on how the sentiment of anti-immigrant sentiment is perceived. So then the hypothesis is that Brexit was a positive shock to the anti-immigrant sentiment. So it changed our views on what we think about immigrants in the UK as a society. And also it was, as a result, this lowered the cost of committing crime. And so you would predict that the hate crimes would increase. We then also argue that that's what happened immediately after the referendum, but actually about a month in, there has been subsequent media backlash and social media backlash against hate crime. So as soon as the media started reporting spikes in hate crime, there has been a kind of a reverse tendency, and the government took action. So I believe by the end of July 2016, they have started voicing the following. So they said that there would be an increased likelihood of tougher sentences for hate crimes, and indeed there has been an uplift in the sentences following that. And they also have increased funding for vulnerable religious institutions, I believe. So there has been a very clear signal to counter this initial anti-immigrant sentiment, which would potentially then lower perceived acceptability of hate crime. So this could explain why we might see a short-lived effect. So we use UK data to do this analysis, partly because, of course, it's a UK matter, so it makes sense to think that we should be looking at UK, and the UK population would respond mostly, but also because the UK data are actually pretty good when it comes to recording crimes. The data collection is standardized. The hate crime laws are uniform across all areas and jurisdictions. They are clearly defined in the National Crime Recording Standard. There have been some improvements in recording in 2015 by the Home Office, and I'll touch upon this later because it will matter for our estimation. Since April 2015, quarterly hate crime data are must be reported, so the reporting became mandatory. In terms of definition, the actual definition of hate crime in England and Wales states that it's any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or another person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice towards someone based on a personal characteristic. And so these are codified on 5 legally protected characteristics. So race and religion, disability, sexual orientation, transgender identity. And we will focus on race and religion here, because we think these would be the most relevant given the anti-immigrant discussion in the campaign in the run-up to Brexit. So we start, as I said, with the quarterly data on racially or religiously aggravated crimes, and these come from public crime data for those 315 community safety partnership areas in England and Wales. Now, these are actually these are bodies, independent bodies, that bring together councillors from local areas and some independent members, and they work together towards increasing safety of these areas. In practice, they mostly coincide with local areas in England and Wales, but in design, they're serving a slightly different function. So one should be mindful of the slight difference here. The data they provide are over counts, but also counts by subgroups and crime groups. And we have a data set that starts in the second quarter of 2007 all the way to first quarter of 2019. We will be analyzing the period from quarter 2 of 2007 to quarter 1 to 2017. The reason we're not looking at the data after 2017 quarter 1 is there have been subsequent terrorist attacks on UK soil, and we think these have triggered hate crime spikes, and which were independent of Brexit. So we don't want to contaminate the result, but we will show you some checks where we use full data period. So just to show you what sort of behavior you see in the data, this is just a plot of the trend of racial and religious hate crime. That's the black line, and the other crimes in the data set, so non-racial and religious hate crime pulled together. That's the kind of grey paler line. The dash.
Sorry, Joanna. I think we've got a question from Carl.
Sorry. Hi, Joanna. Sorry. Very. I probably missed this, and I'm probably terrible for. How's the data recorded? Who collects it?
I believe this is being. I think this is available. You can download it publicly, but I think it's reported by the police, and then possibly on the ONS website that we downloaded it from. Okay.
So it's not from like an experience survey. So it's not like the crime experience survey. It's actual recorded.
No. It's not a survey. Yes. So it's literally all the counts of reported. So it's only reported crimes.
Right.
Anything that made it to the police reports, and that would be captured here. And they are disaggregated by the safety partnership areas.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. We will use some survey data for a check later on, so I'll speak to that later. A thing to notice here is that firstly, you can see that we've used two different scales. On the left-hand side, we have a scale for race and religious hate crime. On the right-hand side, for the non-religious hate crimes. This is because really the proportion of hate crimes overall is very small. And this is something that we'll have to handle in empirics as well. They're relatively infrequent compared to the other crimes. So the scaling here matters. You can also see that it's not obvious that these crimes followed the same trend. There is a lot of seasonality. It seems particularly that there is kind of a higher activity on this front in summer or warmer periods of the year, and it dies down around winter time. And it also seems to us that there has been hate crimes have been already on an increase in the run up to the referendum. Although we do see in this rough plot a spike at the referendum point as well. If I can switch to the next slide. The second data set we have is one that we obtained through Freedom of Information requests. So we sent out identical requests to 45 police force areas in the UK. We have received responses from 33 of these. So we don't have a full coverage of the country. For example, Scotland hasn't given us the information because they said the hate crime was occurring so rarely that it would be identifiable. But we have monthly data on hate crime incidents. These are counts, and these are counts on these 5 main characteristics. And then we combine the racially biased and religiously biased crimes into one category. And this covers the period from January 2011 to February 2017. In the analysis, we'll be using May 2013 to February 2017 because of some changes in recording of crimes between January 2011 and May 2013. So we think it's a cleaner setup. But again, in checks, I'll show you or I'll refer to analysis for using the full period of data we have. We have a companion paper where we show that even though we don't have coverage of all the police forces, there doesn't seem to be obvious selection to respond to the request we sent out on observable characteristics. And these are police force characteristics, but also area characteristics. So we hope that these are representative. I think it's also reassuring that we find the same patterns using the CSP and FOI data. So we're not particularly concerned about selection in this instance. If we do the same exercise as I showed you for the CSP data and plot simply the trends, you can see, again, we have adjusted to different time and to different scales. On the left-hand side is the scale for the race and religious hate crimes, on the right-hand side for the other crimes. Again, the hate crimes are very infrequent. There is, again, seasonality and an increasing pattern in hate crimes in the run-up to the referendum, with a spike around the referendum time that we don't see so much in the other crimes. So let me briefly speak of the methods here. So we start off with the traditional diff and diff. where we just regress the log of a number of hate crimes per 100,000 population in a given crime category. C, in area A, so it's either going to be a CSP area or a police force area, and a given time T. Now we have a marker for whether it's a racial or religious hate crime, and then a function that indicates that Brexit, so function I, which is a function of time. What we're interested in is the coefficient beta, which is coefficient on the interaction between the two, so the racial and religious hate crime, and the indicator for Brexit vote referendum. We then have also group-specific linear trends, year dummies and seasonal dummies, which I will highlight more when we see the results, what exactly we control for. We also control for crime fixed effects and area fixed effects, and then a range of area characteristics. So the things we control for in terms of time varying characteristics, some are related to immigration. So for example, or ethnic diversity, percentage of population who are non-British in the area, relative immigration, relative inflow of migrants to the stock of migrants already in the area, and the change of that annually. And then we look at economic determinants such as percentage of population by various occupation categories as defined in SOC 10 coding, percentage of population with no qualifications, percentage of young male population, unemployment rate, cost of, I think we also have austerity costs per person, and then we have percentage of population working in manufacturing and construction industry, and I think that's probably all the controls we've got there. As I said, the control group here would be other crimes. So the treated crime is the race and religious hate crime. This now relies on strong assumption that the other crimes are not directly impacted by the referendum, and the second assumption that they were on the parallel trends before the referendum. And you've seen that one might question that from the plots. Then we want to expand on the diff and diff a bit and see the exact timing of the effect. And so we run the event study analysis, where we start with 3 pre-referendum dummies, and then in case of the quarterly data set, 4 post-referendum dummies. In case of the monthly data set, 6 post-referendum dummies. It serves as a good test of the parallel trends assumption as the first thing, because you can see whether these are the dummies are statistically significant before the event. But it also allows us to see when the effect is mostly concentrated, in which periods of time. The rest of the specification is as before in terms of the control and trends. We will take the last period before the referendum period as the baseline. So in the quarterly data, that's Q1, because in Q2 we already had the referendum. In the monthly data, the baseline period would be May 2016, because the referendum was in June. Our preferred method is the synthetic control method. So where this approach follows the literature, a series of papers by Abedi and co-authors, where the idea is that we compare the outcomes. So in this case, the treated crimes, the race and religious hate crimes, to a weighted average of the control crimes or the synthetic control. So what the approach does is it generates a counterfactual to the race and religious hate crime by weighting the other crime groups and creating a weighted basket. These weights are generated by matching the groups as much as possible in terms of averages and trends to the race and religious hate crimes in the run-up to the referendum, so the pre-treatment period. We match it by yearly and seasonal averages, and I'll show you the results for log crime rates. However, we also, as a check, use relative crime rates. That is, these would be crime rates divided by the average of that given crime in the quarterly average by in the run-up of to the referendum. The reason one might want to scale it this way is because the hate crime, or the race and religious hate crime, is much less frequent than the other crimes. And so there might be concerns of whether we can actually create a good matching weighted basket as a result. And that's this approach is one that has been suggested by Furman and Pinto in their 2019 paper. We find coinciding results irrespective of which dependent variable we use. You might immediately ask about something, or want to ask about something that I mentioned already in the introduction, that typically this approach would use geographical areas to generate a synthetic match. And then you would match these areas by some characteristics. And that would be, an example of this would be a Beatty paper in 2010, where we have the effect of cigarettes taxes in California. But here the treatment was national. And so the characteristics are identical across crimes within areas. I will, in the robustness checks, show you how one can use other countries to generate synthetic control for the UK. So there we'll be using the hate crimes in other countries to create a weighted basket but of control crimes. But we are concerned about this approach because the data there are many questions around data recording and comparability across countries. Nonetheless, you'll see that we find, broadly speaking, similar results. So we do find effect, but the scale, the magnitude of the effect will differ. So let's dip into the results now. So first set of results, I'll just show you the quarterly effects, and then I'll move on to the monthly. So what you're seeing here is just the difference in difference estimates table, where we start in column 1. You have all specifications will include the economic and immigration area controls that I mentioned, but then we'll be gradually adding various trends. And so our preferred specification will be the last one, so in column 5, where we control for various time trends, but also area fixed effects, quarter of year fixed effects, racial quarter of year fixed effects, separately quarter fixed effects and year fixed effects, and then trends. Trends that are specific to the area, that are specific to a crime group. We also control for remain area specific crime trend, because we argue that remain and leave areas might differ. And then we also control for post-2015 crime trend, and this is to do with the fact that there has been further tightening of the reporting rules in 2015. So we think this way we kind of have quite a bulletproof approach to this. So if you were to use the 5th specification, you find an effect of around just under 15%. We then go through the event study approach, and here you can see I don't actually have a list of controls because it wouldn't fit in the slide, but it's the same. So in the 5th column of this table, we have the full spec of trends and fixed effects, as in the difference in difference equation regression. You can see the top kind of 3 rows of coefficients are the pre-event dummies interacted with the hate crime. And here the worrying thing could be that they are statistically significant positive coefficients, which would suggest indeed that the parallel trend assumption seems to be violated. In the most preferred specification of ours, in the 5th column, you can see that still the 4th quarter of 2015 coefficient is still statistically significant. We think this is because this coincides with terror attacks in Paris. So we think there genuinely has been a potential spike in hate crime at this time in the UK. Nonetheless, this highlights to us that it's even more important to perhaps create a synthetic control rather than rely on event study. If we were to believe these, then you can see that we see already an increase in hate crime in 2nd quarter of 2016, around 17%. even though the vote itself happens on the 23rd of June, so right at the end of the second quarter. So it's difficult to say whether this is an anticipation effect or a result of the vote itself. But the main effect really happens in the third quarter of 2016. So the coefficient there is 0.36, suggesting 36% increase in hate crime. And it seems to die off later on, and the coefficients are less statistically significant in the later quarters. But as I said, we think synth is probably the way to go here. And so what you're seeing now are graphs from the synthetic control estimates using log crime rate as a dependent variable. And in panel A is are the estimates themselves. So the black solid line shows you what happens to the race and religious hate crime, and then the dashed line shows you what happens to the synthetic hate crimes, so those generated crimes. They follow, the trend follows each other more or less. We think we would see it as quite good overlap in the run-up to the event. And then at the point of the event itself, which is marked with this horizontal solid line, you can see a much bigger spike in the race and religious hate crimes relative to the other crimes. The synthetic doesn't really, I mean, there's a bit of a spike, but nowhere near as big. I'll show you just to convince you. When we do the same thing with the relative rate, which would be adjusting for the fact that hate crimes are relatively infrequent compared to the other crimes, the match potentially pre-referendum is possibly better with this, but we also see a spike. In fact, we see a bigger spike in the effect. What you see on the second panel, on panel B, is an inference exercise. So basically, to infer the statistical significance of these effects, we run a series of placebo tests where we would treat or do a placebo on each of the other crimes around the referendum time, and then see whether we have a corresponding spike or not. And then the null hypothesis is that the spike in the race and religious hate crime is statistically different from the changes in the other crimes, the control crimes, and that's how you obtain the statistical significance of these. You might be actually curious about how big these effects actually are. So looking at the effects table, using log rate, we find about 20% spike around the referendum. Using the relative rate, we have a 30% spike. And it's at a 5% significance level. This effect only lasts that 1 quarter if we use synth. And I think that's an important observation here. We then repeat the very same exercise using monthly data now. So what you're seeing now is the set of diff and diff results using monthly data that we have. Again, the 5th column is our preferred specification because it's got a full set of trends and fixed effects included, including the remain crime trend and the post-2015 crime trend. And you can see a bigger effect here, around 26%. But as before, we have a concern, and I apologize, I should have just removed these controls. And I realize the font is really small. But as before, we're concerned about the parallel trends assumption. It doesn't seem to be as obviously violated as it was with the quarterly data, perhaps because here we have monthly data. So there were no specific large events that would have affected hate crimes, we think, in March and April 2016. And perhaps for that reason, when we have a full specification, we don't see clear evidence of the violation of the parallel trends. We do find similar results to CSP in a sense that there is a positive coefficient on the June 2016 interaction with hate crimes already, suggesting increase in hate crimes, which again could be an effect entirely driven by the last week of June following the referendum, or also an anticipation effect. We can't really speak to that. But then the main result, main effect is in July 2016, where the main effect seems to be around 39%, and it seems to die off gradually, although it's still visible in November if we were to use the event study estimates. When we do the synthetic control, the story is different in a sense that we do see a spike again around the referendum, but only in the first month. So then the change in hate crime, the increase kind of quickly follows by a fall, and the post-July 2016 dummies are not statistically significant anymore. So I'll just go, so I'll show you the relative crime as well. The spike using the relative crime rate seems to be larger, but it's consistent with the log crime rate that we presented. In terms of the size of these effects, when we use monthly data, the effect in July is around 19% using the log rate, but 38% using the relative rate. So there's quite a window here in terms of the magnitude. The spike is clear, and what's also clear is that we don't find any statistically significant effects following July 2016. We do a range of checks on this. So we have played around with alternative control groups. For example, aggregating all the crimes to one control group, or using different more aggregated groupings. So initially we use subgroups of crimes, and then we can aggregate them up. The results hold. Then we did also checks on the periods of analysis, because as I said, for the CSP data, we decided not to use the data after first quarter 2017 because we were worried about the terror attacks that happened afterwards and their effect on hate crime. And for the monthly data, we decided not to use the data pre-2013 because of some changes in recording. Again, these results hold, even when we exclude the period. So I can quickly show you the graphs, but you can see the effects. So this is for the quarterly data. The diff and diff gives you still positive coefficient of around 12%. We very clearly, when we extend the period with the quarterly data, we have a very clear violation of the parallel trend assumption. So I think that also, another statistically significant spike after the 2017 Q1, which I think reassures us that it's a right thing to do, not to look at periods after the 2017 Q1 because of other events that would have triggered a response in hate crimes. We also, in one specification, exclude Greater London because London is very different from the rest of the country, mostly voted to remain, but is also very international and highly diverse. And the results hold again. I think with the exclusion of London, that exercise we can only do for the quarterly data. But I think the most important check here is that, and this is very much ongoing, so we're happy to hear your views because we're still collecting this data, but we have recently set out to collect data on hate crimes in other countries and use other countries rather than crime groups to create a synthetic control group. Okay, so just kind of follow this approach that you would have probably seen in papers until now, where the geographical areas are being matched with UK on crime trends before the event and weighted to build a synthetic control that would behave as close in terms of the trend to hate crime in the UK before the referendum. So we matched them on up until Q3 of 2015, and then we allow a referendum to happen. And at the moment, we have the country, 31 states of the US. We have Germany, I believe, at state level data, Denmark, Italy, Czechia, Belgium, Canada, and Victoria State in Australia. We are working on getting more data in. It's just a bit of a time-consuming exercise. We are worried a little bit about this approach because the definition definitions and hate crime laws will differ across these countries. So will the reporting practices. And there might have been events also that would influence the trends and shocks in different areas differently. So just as an example, in 2015, EU had significant migration crisis that would have fueled the anti-immigration rhetoric. This was not such a big issue in the US. Okay, so we're a bit worried about the kind of context as well. I'll show you results for synth. We decided to only use the relative crime count here because of the different reporting practices, because the data we have capture only reported, not actual level of hate crimes, and the levels are also not comparable across countries. So to kind of try and alleviate some of these issues, we decided it's safer to use the relative crime count, and it also produces a better pre-Brexit referendum match. So this is what we get. Again, in panel A, you've got the actual estimates. So the dark line is the race and religious hate crime in England and Wales, and the dashed line is the synthetic control based on a range of geographical areas that we have. They are following relatively closely, particularly after 2010 in terms of the trend, and you can see a clear spike for the hate crime in England and Wales around the referendum time, which is not matched by the synthetic control. In terms of the magnitudes here, they are bigger. So the effect is only statistically significant in the third quarter of 2016, but it's large. It's suggesting that a spike of 49% if we were to use the international comparisons here. So larger than we find in our preferred setting. Again, we do the placebo test for inference, and we do find that the first quarter after the referendum is the only statistically significant coefficient. So after that, the effect dies off. I should have probably said that for synthetic control estimates, for all of the approaches, we no longer use the disaggregated regional level information, but it's all aggregated up to the national level. I think I missed that when discussing the approach. And then we also wanted to make sure that we actually understand why this might be, and that we rule out potential alternatives, alternative explanation for the spike we actually find. And the two key things we were worried about is that people's reporting behavior would have changed as a result of coverage of hate crimes, or police recording behavior would have changed. So we ran two checks on this. Firstly, focusing on the victim side, we used the crime survey of England and Wales, which is a survey, so obviously just asks questions on a subsample of population, but is a survey of firstly experiencing crime, but also reporting crime once you experienced it. And we do find, so we use this in the different event study, different specification, sorry, where we're looking at the probability of reporting a crime, and the rest of the specification is the same. And we do find that there is an increase in probability of reporting a hate crime following Brexit referendum. So it's about 5.5 percentage points. So it's not entirely the case that the behavior hasn't changed. However, translating this 5.5 percentage points increase, it's only explaining a small effect or small part of the effect that we find overall. Then the second thing we do is we look at the police behavior by downloading from the police website information about outcomes of crime. So basically they categorize all the reports crimes outcomes as positive, negative, or neutral. And so we can look at these and see what happened to these after Brexit referendum. And so there is an increase in negative outcomes and a fall in positive outcomes, no change to neutral outcomes. Why would this matter and what does it tell us? The idea is this: if people were likely to record more crimes of hate, of racial and religious nature, because they become more sensitive to them, it's potentially possible that these will become less significant crimes than previously reported, and as such, therefore, the outcomes are more could potentially be there. We could observe more negative outcomes, and so this is what we're trying to see here in this check. What's the probability of the outcome being negative after Brexit? And we see that there is a slightly higher probability in that at an expense of positive outcomes, which might suggest that there has been a slight change in police behavior in terms of recording. Again, that coefficient is not big enough in the magnitude, in terms of magnitude, to cancel out what we already, entirely what we find. And then we wanted to know how kind of social media and print media reporting fits in here. So what we do is we collected information through LexisNexis on print media, and specifically we counted articles that were dealing with either Brexit referendum or hate crime. We did a search on keywords and created monthly counts before and after the referendum. And then we did a similar exercise with Twitter. So we created monthly counts of tweets that touch upon Brexit or hate crime. And then we basically run a diff where we interact the event with social media reporting. So you can see firstly that we find spike, unsurprisingly, we find spike in the article coverage, so print media coverage of referendum and hate crime, and we find a spike around the referendum in the tweets about the topic. So I think that's as expected. And then we run regressions with either log count articles interacted with hate crime dummy or the lag of them. And we find Brexit articles not so much, but for hate crime articles and Brexit tweets, we find positive correlations here that would suggest that there is a, we won't say this is causal for sure, this could be going too directional, but there is a correlation between the coverage of these topics in media and in social media and the increased incidence of hate crimes. Interestingly enough, for the newspaper coverage, the effect seems to be either immediate or still there within a month, but for tweets, it's within a month. I realize that for tweets, it's probably already a month is a long period because these usually live for a couple of days. But given that our crime data are monthly, we couldn't really go into a more fine-tuned effects. Again, here, the social media might play a contributing role. The coefficients are not large enough to kind of explain the whole story. And then we look at the heterogeneous effects because we thought that it would be interesting to see. We guessed that the effect wouldn't have been uniform across the country. And indeed, when we look at leave and remain areas, then the synthetic estimates for remain suggest an effect of around 12% when we use the log of the crime rate and 25% when we use the relative crime rate. And I think it's only the 25% effect that's statistically significant. Whereas when we look at leave areas, the effect ranges between 25 and 30%, depending on specification. What we found as well is that this seems to be driven by crimes against property, not against persons. So in the just in the quarterly data, we have the information about the type of victim, so whether it's just public or property or against persons. And when we rerun the diff and also the event study, you can see for crimes against persons in our full specification, we don't actually get statistically significant coefficients. I mean, there is a positive coefficient on the third quarter, so the first period after the referendum, but it's not statistically significant. Whereas the results where we look at crimes against committed against property or public are very similar to what we've seen before, and they're statistically significant. So it seems that the behavior was mostly targeting kind of buildings or property. And then we also wanted to know whether there was a variation in behavior depending on the characteristics of the area, so the demographics and the economic and characteristics of the area. And so we find that there's positive correlation with proportion of young males in the population, and perhaps some negative weak correlation with the minority population. But we don't really find statistically significant effects on other area characteristics like presence of or percentage of people in a given industry or by socioeconomic occupation code. So it seems that these two dimensions might matter. But again, these would be correlations rather than causal effects. So I think now might be a good point to try and sum up. I realize that I've flooded you with information. We think that Brexit acted as something, an event that conveyed information about societal views. And particularly, we think it had a potential of changing a social norm or updating a social norm in the UK, particularly around the immigration issues. We argue that breaking a norm comes at a cost, and then this cost is actually lower if you receive a signal that the norm you thought was common in the country is weaker than initially assumed. We've seen something, the reason we're saying this is we've seen a similar phenomenon around Trump's rise to popularity and then increased willingness to express anti-immigration views in the US. So there's already a paper on that. And so Brexit, to an extent, made public the society's views on anti-immigration that might have been private until now. And so by looking at hate crime, we're examining an effect on observable kind of breakdown of social norms. So hate crime is here exemplifying how social norms are potentially changing. We find that the effect is large, ranging from 15 to 25% increase in hate crimes in the first quarter in England and Wales, and it's larger in leave areas or areas that voted to leave the EU. We also can say that it's not entirely explained by victim reporting increasing or the recording of the crime data increasing. But I probably should remind you that it seems lower than the reports of Home Office of 40% increase in hate crimes in July 2016 relative to July 2015. What we also did is thought about how it then compares to other events that are likely to create spikes in hate crime. And looking at the literature, these would be, for example, terrorist attacks. And so we actually find that this information shock around the referendum is potentially comparable in length and the relative magnitude to a terrorist attack. So I'll finish on that last table, where what we did is just run an event study, but now accounted for referendum in June, July, August, September, but also for Lee Rigby murder in 2013, sorry. And events following in 2014 when case made it to court, Charlie Hebdo in 2015, which is obviously an event outside of the UK, and then general elections and Paris attacks. And we find that the effect of the Brexit referendum is probably on the lines in terms of the magnitude with the Lee Rigby murder, but not is bigger than the other events that we looked at. So I think that's also an interesting parallel to finish on. And I'll stop here because I probably talked for too long already.
Thanks, Joanna. That was really good. Are there any questions for Joanna? Yes, Stefania.
Hi, Joanna. Hi. My question is, so basically, are you trying to say that your results are basically capturing the effect of the vote in the referendum? So where there be a referendum that ended up being Remain, is this what you're capturing? Is the is this the fact, or is also including all the campaign that came with the referendum? Otherwise, really the timing is essential.
We think it's the effect of the referendum and the fact that the outcome was a surprise. So in a sense, yes, there was a run-up in the campaign that I think that therefore we use synth because we know that perhaps there has been a kind of increase in hate crime patterns. But we think the kind of turning point was the fact that the outcome came as a surprise. So people did not expect that such a big proportion of the population would want to leave, and therefore that shock changed their changed potential perpetrators' perceptions of how immigrants are perceived in the country. So we think it would have been the referendum itself.
Yeah. So then, in that sense, you are so the fact that the crime was already rising before doesn't really matter. What you want to look at is really how hate crime was right before the referendum, and so already fueled by the campaign versus right after. So I want, because now at the moment you're averaging over, I think, 4 quarters before the referendum when you do your diff and diff. And I wonder if this is more like a sort of discontinuity type of, so where you really want to focus on that narrow window to capture this effect of.
But then, so I see your point, but then I think that's why we use synth. So when we use synth, we are we're creating this counterfactual basket of crimes that would be matching the hate crime on its trend right until the event.
Okay, so that would be
and so this kind of helps us deal with the concerns that there has been the increasing trend in hate crimes before the referendum, and then by doing also the relative crime, we're dealing with the second issue, which is that hate crimes are quite infrequent. So matching them on any control group is a bit tricky because they're small in proportion to the other crimes. But we could, I think we're achieving this with synth, but we could probably think about discontinuity as well.
Okay, because I was seeing, that the pre-referendum results were different across different specifications. So maybe this is what you're trying to do is, okay, yes.
Joel, did you want to say something since you turned your camera? We can't hear you. No, we can't hear you, so sorry. I think we might need to defer that, but I think, the reason we prefer synth is because it will be dealing with the potential increase pre-referendum.
I think Simonetta had her hand up next.
Yes, thank you. This is very interesting. Apologies for not using the camera. I have the sun on the back.
It's fine.
It would just be a black thing. So if I may, I have three questions. So the first one is about the community safety partnership data. So you showed the graph, the map, and it looked to me like they're relatively small areas. And if I understand what your argument, by the way, I don't know anything about this literature. The idea is that you're interested in people who commit the crime, right? Because they are the one who have been prompted by the referendum. But then the crime is recorded in an area, and you kind of assume that it's recorded in the same area where the person is actually living, right? Where the person was voting is where the same area where they committed the crime. So in a way, I would think the police force area is I would be more inclined to believe that sort of data, just because the areas are bigger enough so that there is not too much movement, difference between where people live and where the crime is. And possibly that's why then comparing across countries, then everything is in there, right? So that's why I think it's relatively convincing.
Yeah, I think so. You're right. We have discussed this particularly when we look at leave and remain, because yes, we don't observe where the perpetrator is from. We observe where the crime was reported. So by all means, you're absolutely right in here. The police force areas are bigger areas, so there's probably a lower risk of this. But none of, I should probably emphasize in the context of this, none of the results, or in the paper, we're trying to be very careful about writing it the right way. None of the results about leave and remain are indicating that these are leave or remain voters for the very same reason, because we just see reports in the areas. But that's, yeah, you're right that we can't, we can't pinpoint where the perpetrators are from. It might well be that, you know, they come from a neighboring town to attack. Although this would be a bit of an organized effort, but we can't rule it out.
And the other question is about the hate crime itself. So you discussed about the reporting, but I'm not quite sure I really understanding. I mean, what I'm thinking is, so I might be a victim of crime, right? Last year I might have thought it's just a crime. Now that it's after the referendum, after, you know, there has been all this discussion about hate crime, I might actually change the way I report it, not the probability of reporting, but now I would feel, oh, it's because it's of my race. Although, by the way, you have to be of a different race, right?
Or nationality.
Nationality
nationality
too.
is also,
right.
yeah. So
okay.
It's not just on the basis of race, it's also by nationality. But
okay, I didn't get that.
Yeah. And this is true. So we can't tell whether people have just started to classify the crimes that they're reporting differently. I think in the crime survey of England and Wales, there is a question on what the crime was that classifies it into a type. And then, so if the respondent was a victim of crime, then conditional on having been a victim of crime, or I think witnessing a crime, have they reported it. But as you've seen in that check in that data set, we see some increase in reporting of crimes. It could be that they are more willing to report, or that they suddenly see these crimes as hate crimes. We can't probably disentangle which effect it is.
Can I just add something? Sorry, it's
yeah.
Sorry. The other thing we do is look at other crimes. So imagine people are just now reclassifying all of their hate, like what would have been a normal crime, into hate crime. You might expect changes in the kind of the proportion of other crimes.
Yeah.
And we don't really see that happening. Now, of course, these are very low numbers, so it might be hard to detect something, but at least that kind of gives us some indication that people aren't necessarily all jumping into doing that. So we don't see like a big drop in kind of assaults straight after the referendum, for example. Thanks. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
I also think, I wonder now, I haven't thought about this before, the fact that we're actually seeing an increase in the increase in hate crime seems to be driven by crimes against property, makes me wonder whether people would have classified it differently before. Because I don't know, I haven't looked into the other evidence of this, but whether I'm associating this as perhaps bricks being thrown through properties, or graffiti, offensive graffiti being written, or something like this, then I guess these might have been, oh, I don't know, maybe bricks not, but the graffiti would have been potentially immediately perceived by people in the past also as, you know, racially or religiously aggravated. Yeah.
And this brings me to my last question, if I can. I'm not quite sure what is a criminal, crime, right? What is considered crime and what is not? Because I could think of many kind of incidents that may be racially prompted by race, but not necessarily classed as crime, in the sense that they're not big enough. And as you say, the numbers are small, but the discussion in the media seemed to suggest that there were a lot of smaller incidents.
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think that's probably a call. I mean, in terms of if you come forward to the police, they are going to basically record any criminal offense. And I think in the statistics, then they do have different types. So, you know, in terms of hate crimes, I believe we, not in the monthly data that we obtained, because we only obtained counts, but in the CSP data, quarterly data, they also look at what kind of act it was. So within that protected characteristic, what actually happened, and that's where we get the property versus person as well. So they do categorize them and start with offenses and then probably more serious crimes that are persecuted. But I guess we can't speak to the people's perception of, is this something worth reporting? That we can't really, we can't capture. Yeah. So if there was a significant change in behavior, then this wouldn't be, this is potentially problematic, but the check that we run suggests that there might have been, not to the extent that would explain the whole increase that we find.
Yeah, thank you.
Stephen, go ahead.
Hi. So my first question, I'm really sorry if this was mentioned. So during the in these graphs, what there seemed to be is that there are these increases in the trends of hate crimes, but not the ones that are supposedly salient to the ones that were, you know, part of your study. They seem to be going up already. And sort of this is so you completely convinced me on the spike after the Brexit, sort of already on your first graph. Like you already had me, that was fine, right? But what's happening with these trends beforehand? You can already see in 2013.
Okay, so we think these are other unrelated events. So for example, in 2013, there was the murder of Lee Rigby that caused spike. In the reason we worry about parallel trends, and in the 2015, I think Q4, we seem to have a positive coefficient in the event study. This coincides with Paris attacks. So we think some of these spikes in the kind of periods further down in the past are related to terrorist events rather than political events that happened within the UK or in Europe. And so we see spikes. And that's obviously also another reason for kind of being careful about the periods of analysis that we're using, and excluding explicitly some of them. So for example, the same happens later, so we don't see it in the trend, but in second or third quarter of 2017, there was another set of attacks in London. So we have seen another spike, which we don't believe is related to Brexit, but it's basically because hate crime responds to other events as well.
No, so it's more. My question is more. Sorry, it's more. You know, someone that discriminates against a transgender and someone that discriminates a racist is. Do you think that this is sort of that basically on these plots that what we're looking at is just that there are some people that have this certain salience, this latent, you know, desire to be discriminatory, to create hate crimes, and then it's essentially, you know, they'll do one or the other depending upon how much they're incited to do one or the other. Or I'm more looking at the gray line from 2000,
okay,
let's say onwards.
So
up.
So the gray line doesn't have any hate crimes in it. So we have excluded the disability. So the gray lines are all the other crimes that are reported in the UK for all other categories that are not hate crimes, which is why the scale is so much bigger. Because so we don't consider at all the disability, the transgender. We focus on, so the solid line would be the race and religious hate crimes, and then the gray line or the faded line is other crimes that are not being marked as hate crimes of any kind.
But I thought
sorry, can I ask?
Yes. No,
sorry. Just wanted to clarify. Does that include crime against women? The gray line.
Yeah, exactly.
In what sense? If it's not categorized as hate crime, if say a woman is a victim, then yes, it would be within that. Yeah, I think we could exclude that, I guess, to check.
So it would include rapes and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I think we haven't excluded those. We potentially can, yeah.
No, but in the beginning of your talk, you had sort of 5 hate crime categories, and you said, oh, we're only going to focus on 2 or 3 of them.
Yes. So in the data, we have the 5 groupings. So we've got the race,
right,
religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender. We don't actually look at all at disability, sexual orientation, and transgender. So what we do is we combine the race and religion. That's our RRHC, and that's the treated crime, because we think, given the narrative around migration, if there's hate crime increase, these would be the 2 kind of categories under which it falls. And then the control crimes are other crimes that are not marked as hate crimes at all.
Why? Why not use these ones? So if there's
because
just
there's
a change in the view of hate crimes, that basically they are, that hate crimes are something that are becoming more and more important, which perhaps in the last 7-8 years has been the case, then it would actually maybe make more sense to have your controls being the sexual orientation,
So partly it's because I think of these hate crimes, race and religion are most frequent, and the others we might not observe enough of. So if you think about control being actually quite big enough group as well, we already are challenged by the fact that hate crimes are infrequent. It's even less frequent to experience transgender, sexual orientation, or disability crimes. So it's most common in hate crimes for these to be race and religion. Yeah, so that's also one practical reason not to do that this way.
I mean, I'm totally convinced. So it's not about convincing.
No, I understand.
It's more my curiosity about that previous trend that's going up, sort of trying to figure out what's happening there, because that's super interesting to me. And
so what you see in here at the moment in the gray line is just behavior of other crimes, and there's a lot of seasonality in them as well.
For sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to transition to a tiny small other question if I can. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to ask if both the hate crimes as well as the all other crimes, whether that in your heterogeneity analysis tracks with things like the impact of austerity on the local authority.
So we have. Let me get to this. I do have these plots. We don't find much by. I don't remember if we looked at austerity. So we looked at by immigration flow. So low versus high immigration, don't see much. Industry, so construction, manufacturing, minority population density. We haven't actually looked by austerity. No, we did look at by austerity. So this is the last graph. I apologize for the size of it. You can see that we just categorize it as dummies, low and high. And you can see that they're not statistically significantly different effects. So Brexit here is in Q2, and this is the first quarter after Brexit, and the effects seem to be comparable. So the austerity, we did think along these lines, thinking these areas might be more kind of negatively biased.
But not just around Brexit, but just in general. So is that sort of a driver of hate crimes? Within the
so I don't have that, because these are the coefficients from the interaction term, so they would be of the austerity on the around Brexit or following Brexit. I haven't
sort of thinking about what's behind these increasing trends.
I don't remember, to be honest. I don't know if Joel remembers. He's done most of the analysis, but yeah, I can double check that, but I don't know off the top of my head.
So can I? It's a perfect. Because I was super curious about actually these heterogeneous effects. Like I was really waiting for stuff to come out there, right? That would show that sort of, be able to sort of target policy more in the future of knowing where hate crime is and is not, and sort of you're basically like a lot of the stuff you're showing is showing no effect. And I was just wondering, because I even went to look at the paper, so I'm especially looking at the remain versus leave areas where you really would have expected a large difference in the hate crime. And I'm just wondering if we're actually one of the things that's masking, or that one of the things that's masking their effect is the scale that you're using. So if these remain areas, how close to zero are those numbers? Because you have a log outcome, and so you're going to be taking percentage differences. And so it might be that just the traction of those small changes that are very close to zero are driving an effect that then looks like what is a very large effect for the leave areas.
But okay, so on the slide I've got the log outcomes by remain and leave, but I believe we've done it using the relative crime as well, which would be dividing by the average crime category in that period, and in the pre-Brexit period. So it will be scaling it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I believe there we find similar effects. So they're larger effects. So you're right on that count, because I gave you brackets where I said I think in remain it's 12 to 25%, and in leave it's 25 to 30%. And the higher values in both cases come from the relative crime. So it's a synthetic control method using relative crime rather than the log. So there might be something to it. So the effects are larger, but they're still ranging, about 25% for remain and 30% for leave.
Have you tried relative to the size of the non-British population? Because I think the thing with like leave versus remain areas is that you've got sort of two countervailing things which combine to produce a hate crime, right? So you've got the level of animosity in, say, the British population, and then you've got sort of the level of contact, right? So if and we know that these two things move in opposite directions, that that the level of animosity is probably higher in areas where the level of contact is low, but of course, these two things need to combine to produce an observed hate crime.
So are you suggesting that we look at an interaction of leave or remain with the percentage of non-British in that area? No, I'm not sure I understand what you were suggesting.
So I'm suggesting looking at the count of hate crime relative to the size of the non-British population.
So scaling it.
Yeah.
We haven't done that. But you're right with the context, or maybe Joel was correcting me that we have done that. He wrote something to me. Hang on. Yeah. So as you can tell, Joel has run most of the analysis, and we did check this, and he says that we have a problem with parallel trend assumption being violated when we do that. So when we're scaling by the population, non-British population, yeah.
But I think that could
Thanks,
probably
Joel.
be why you're getting sort of nonlinear effects with versus remain. So we're just over 4 o'clock. Are there any sort of straggling, real quick questions that we can ask before we say goodbye?
Everyone's ready for a coffee break.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we all have to have our coffees sort of individually.
I know.
But thank you, Joanna, for a really interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Your questions and for showing up here. Yep. So everyone have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will reconvene for the final seminar of the term next week with Julia Verts from Bristol.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.